So let's start again. This is Breaking the Code for Storytelling Mastery, and I am Doug Liman. Let's see if I do that. I see. Okay. The most common obstacle that business people face when trying to use storytelling. For example, in business, we're taught to speak only in abstraction. An example of an abstraction is, our goal is to increase productivity. And there's nothing wrong with abstractions. They're important and they give us information. But they lack the ability to stimulate the sensory imagination. They lack the ability to stimulate emotion and to motivate it and to arouse our team spirit and more. So the skill that most business people lack is adjusting each sentence of a story so that it adds just the right weight to your goals for the story. So if you think of magicians, stage magicians, they know how to direct your attention in the ways that they want it to be directed. So they can give you the pleasure of seeing the rabbit disappear without the disappointment of seeing the magician sneak the rabbit into his pocket. Well, great storytellers also direct your attention, but most of them do it intuitively. So if you ask them, how do you do it? They don't know. But I've coached business storytellers, taught business storytelling for decades. And I have learned how this works and how to explain it. So in the next minutes, I'm going to show you this in three parts. Three parts. So first we'll look at a different art, painting, so you can understand adjustment sliders. And then second, I'll introduce you to the most basic story adjustment slider, which I call the concreteness slider. And then third, we'll analyze how this slider works by applying it to a folktale. So here's our painting. We'll begin. The painting is called Diana or Christ. It was painted in 1881 in England. And before I ask you anything more about this, who looks like the main character to you? Who is this painting about? Take a moment. If you're like most people, this all changed. Well, if you're like most people, you choose the woman with her hand over her chest, dressed in white. For most of us, she is the main character. So the question is, well, let's give her story. She is a Christian, and she is standing in the Roman Colosseum, and there is a statue of the goddess Diana. And below that is Diana's sacred incense burner. And just behind that is a young woman holding an open box. And just to our right of that is a man who has his mouth almost up to the ear of the woman in white. And in his hand, he has some of those grains of incense. So she's that close. If she just reaches a couple inches into his hand, she can pick up one of the grains of incense. And if she grabs even one and throws it into Diana's incense burner, she will live. But if not, we know what happens in the Colosseum. The Romans threw Christians to the lions. So that's the story. This is a crucial moment for her. So how did the painter help us know where to look to know that she's the main character? Well, we're going to look at three hidden techniques. The first is called the rule of thirds. The idea is that if you divide the painting into three vertical areas and into three horizontal areas, then the viewer's eye is more likely to go to any object on one of those grid lines, and most strongly to the intersections of any two grid lines. So let's superimpose this grid over our painting. And what do we notice? There is only one face in that painting that has is at the intersection of two grid lines. It's our woman in white. So that's a hidden technique, the rule of thirds. What are some other hidden techniques to direct our attention to her? If we look at her, if we look at the area where she is surrounded by men wearing dark clothes, we will see that she is light, they are dark, and so she stands out in contrast. And if we look to our left, we see that the similar thing happens with the man in red. In his case, the things behind him are light and he is dark, and that makes him stand out. If we also look at her clothing, we see another technique. Her clothing is in sharp detail, but the clothing of the man to our right of her has no detail at all. So that's a third technique for directing our attention to her. But I don't want you to take my word for it that those hidden techniques actually work. For you to really believe that they work, you need to see what happens if we adjust them. So I have selected just the woman's figure in Photoshop. That's what the dotted white lines around her mean. So any adjustment I make in Photoshop will apply just to her figure and not to anyone else. So here are 3 Photoshop sliders. And the bottom one is lightness. And we are going to reduce her lightness quite a lot. Let's see the effect. She no longer looks like the main character. She disappears into the row of dark characters. And instead, our eye goes to the 3 people who are lighter to our left of her. Let's now put the lightness back, but change the saturation. We're taking almost all the color out of her. And what's the effect? She's the most important person again, but for a different reason. She now looks strange. Is she a corpse? Is she a statue? The artist wants us to look at her, but that's not enough. For the painting to have the desired impact, we need to look at her for the right reason. So let's change her back and change now her hue. We're moving things just a little bit in the direction of pink. Oops. And so when she looks pink that way, she still looks important, but now for a different reason. Because when we see someone whose face is a little red, we attribute that to either embarrassment or arousal of some form. And with the young man so close to her, I interpret it as sexual arousal. So this slight change in hue changes our perception of why she's there. So we've just looked at some painting adjustment sliders: lightness, saturation, and hue, and how these sliders can be applied to a painting to help the painter achieve the painter's goal. Now let's go on to our second part, the concreteness slider in storytelling. So just as the grid lines, the brightness, the darkness help us focus on what the artist wants us to see, the element of concreteness in a story can help the story listeners focus on what the storyteller wants us to hear. So in this second part, we'll introduce you to a story adjustment slider, which I call the concreteness slider. So, back in 2014, I was cleaning out my living room. That meant I was taking the used newspapers from that week to the recycle bin. And as I walked carrying a pile of papers, I glanced down at the photo that was on the top paper. And I saw this smiling face of this young girl. But on the bottom of her, I saw that she was using braces to walk, and she had lost a leg. That contrast may be interesting. So I read the headline below it. It said, "Nearly a year after Boston Marathon terrorist attack, amputees are continuing to improve." And that was interesting enough to me because I remembered that there had been a bombing at the end of this race the year before. So I turned the paper over to read the article. And I read the youngest amputee, Jane Richard, was 7 years old at the time of the attack. And I thought, oh, poor kid. And I read on. The girl's brother, 8-year-old Martin Richard, was killed in the attack and their mother was severely wounded. I thought, that's terrible. And then I read, she has returned to school but has not yet been able to resume Irish step dancing. And suddenly I was at the point of tears. Why? Well, I had I had moved from sympathy for her, thinking, poor kid, that's so terrible, to empathy for her, to feeling what she felt. And why did I feel that? Because I understood that Irish step dancing is a form of dancing that only matters from the waist down. Everything important happens just in the legs. So you can't do it with an artificial leg. And I knew that for young girls like her who take lessons in Irish step dancing, that it becomes something they do multiple times every week. On the weekend, they go to demonstrations, and they may even engage in competitions. So she didn't just lose a hobby, she lost a way of life. And then I read on in the newspaper, Irish step dancers across the country have been raising money for her. And once again, I was moved to tears because this was other people showing their caring. So what creates the caring that I felt? Suppose that this was different. Instead of, she's returned to school but has not yet been able to resume Irish step dancing, it had said, she's returned to school but has not yet been able to resume her favorite after-school activity. Or, instead of Irish step dancers across the country have been raising money for her, it had said, Irish step dancers across the country feel bad about her loss and hope she recovers. Those changes would make it so much less emotionally effective. So it turns out that storytelling has a special role in it for concreteness. Stories in their essence describe the particular. At one moment, in one place, one character performs one concrete action. Why is that powerful? Because that's how we experience life. We don't say, oh, I'm having an after-school activity. We say, now I'm doing Irish step dancing. And that means that concreteness in a story helps us imagine someone else's experience. So what if we had terminology that could describe the level of concreteness? Then we could be more aware of how we adjust the concreteness in each part of a story. So I have created a terminology. We'll use the term concrete action statement to refer to a particular level of concreteness near the middle of the scale. So if the scale on the left has no concreteness and on the right has the highest level of concreteness, then a concrete action statement will be just to the right of the middle. So here's an example. John ate a bowl of cereal. I define a concrete action in 3 ways. First, it shows a character doing something specific. Secondly, it could usually be easily drawn without you having to make major decisions about what to draw. And third, it moves the narrative forward. That is, it shows the next action in the story. So if we zoom in from a concrete action statement, like John ate a bowl of cereal, what might be an example of a more concrete statement that could replace this one in the story? Well, here's an example. John picked up his spoon, dipped it in the bowl, then brought the cereal to his mouth. This covers the same action as John ate a bowl of cereal. And I call this a blow-by-blow statement. I define a blow-by-blow statement as it describes concrete actions. It describes a series of them that might also be described as a single concrete action. Here's an example from Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. If it was 7 o'clock of a very warm evening in the Seone Hills, when Father Wolf woke up from his day's rest, scratched himself, yawned, and spread out his paws one after the other to get rid of the sleepy feeling in the tips. So to see if this is a blow-by-blow statement, we have to ask ourselves 3 questions. Is it composed of concrete action? I say yes. Father Wolf woke up, scratched himself, yawned, and spread out his paws. And does it contain more than one concrete action? Yes, I just said 4 of them. Might this also be described as a single action? Well, let's try it out. How about if you just said Father Wolf woke up? So that is a single concrete action that takes the place of this whole blow-by-blow. What would be a less concrete action statement? Go ahead. That could replace John ate a bowl of cereal. How about John had breakfast? I call this a summarized action statement. Let's notice that a blow-by-blow is very detailed, very concrete. A concrete action statement is less concrete. A summarized statement is even less concrete. What would be even less concrete than that? We can have what I call a summarized action statement. I define that as having 4 parts. First, it describes action but without detail. Second, it summarizes one or more actions or scenes. Usually it could not be easily illustrated without making major decisions about specifics. And like the blow-by-blow and the concrete action statement, this 3rd level, the summarized action statement, still moves the narrative forward. An example from Kipling: once he tried to feed all the animals in all the world in one day. And does that describe an action without detail? Yes. Does it summarize one or more actions or scenes? Yes. When you try to feed all the animals, you have to try to feed these animals and then feed these animals and then feed these animals. Could you easily illustrate it without having to make major decisions? No. Does it move the narrative forward? Does it show the next action? It does. So an even less concrete statement than a summarized one might be, to live alone, you need to be able to feed yourself. Notice this statement is so abstract that it cannot replace one of the other statements. In other words, it doesn't move the narrative forward. So abstract statements, I define them. First, they do not directly describe an action in the story. Now, they can describe an action that's not in the story, like some people spill cereal when they eat. Second, they can help us understand the action or interpret the action. Third, they're always optional because the narrative can exist without them. And fourth, they don't move the narrative forward. They don't show the next action in the story. So they can't replace a more concrete statement. I said they can help us understand or interpret the action. So first you hear John ate a bowl of cereal, but then when you hear to live alone you need to be able to feed yourself, you may conclude that John might be eating to prove that he can live alone. In this way, the abstract statement helps us interpret the other statements. So this is our entire concreteness slider. And so we have finished part 2. And in part 3, we're going to apply this slider to an excerpt from a folktale. This is from the German folktale known in English as Rapunzel. Every evening, the prince visited Rapunzel in her tower, but such secrets are hard to keep. One day, the witch discovered Rapunzel's deception. The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel. In her anger, she seized Rapunzel by her beautiful hair, wrapped the hair several times around her left hand, and then, grasping a pair of shears in her right, snip-snap, the beautiful locks lay on the ground. And she was so hard-hearted that she took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place where Rapunzel lived in great woe and misery. So here's our excerpt. First thing I want to ask you is, what was vivid for you about that excerpt? What stays in your mind? And for nearly everyone, it's the haircut. So let's go, with that in mind, let's go on. Let's place each of these phrases or sentences from Rapunzel on the concrete action statement slider. If it's a blow-by-blow, we'll give it a B. If it's a concrete action, we'll give it C-O-N-C. If it's summarized, we'll give it an S. If it's abstract, we'll give it an A. So every evening, the prince visited Rapunzel in her tower. So that's... Every evening, the prince visited Rapunzel in her tower. It's not abstract because there's an actual action in it. It's not blow by blow. So is it summarized or concrete? But you couldn't draw visiting Rapunzel because we don't know exactly what she did. So therefore, it's summarized. But such secrets are hard to keep. Is there an action in that? No. So this is abstract. One day, the witch discovered Rapunzel's deception. Discovered deception is an action, but it's not concrete, so it's summarized. The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel. Now, climbing up and grabbing, those are concrete. The next one, in her anger, she seized Rapunzel by her beautiful hair, wrapped the hair several times around her left hand, and then grasping a pair of shears in her right, snip-snap, the beautiful locks lay on the ground. That's obviously blow by blow. And she was so hard-hearted, there's no action, so it's abstract. She took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place. It's an action, but it's not concrete, so it's summarized. And finally, where she lived in great woe and misery. And for me, the verb lived here is an action verb. She lived and she lived and she lived. So let's count how many of each of these kinds of statements we have. There are 8 statements altogether. And if we look, there are 2 abstract statements. There are 4 summarized statements. There is only 1 concrete statement, and there's only 1 blow-by-blow. So notice what happened here. The only 2 statements are concrete or blow-by-blow. Only 2 statements are concrete or blow-by-blow. We have 8 statements, and only 2 of them are on the right half of the slider. And what do we notice about those 2 statements? Those are the 2 that describe the thing we most remembered from this part of the story. Notice that the first 3 statements are not concrete, and the last 3 statements are not concrete. And if they were, it would draw attention away from the part that matters the most. So we see here the power of adjusting the concreteness of each sentence in a story. It makes the most important parts the most vivid in our minds. So just as the painter, as we saw, adjusts dark and light to make the most important figures stand out, the storyteller adjusts concreteness to make the most important actions stand out. But as it turns out, actions, as important as they are not the only important things in the story. Other things need to be adjusted too. For example, there's other key sliders like the sensory detail slider. When you tell stories, part of your job is to stimulate your listeners to imagine. And sometimes that can be assisted by offering sensory detail. So John ate a bowl of cereal has no sensory detail. But John ate a bowl of sweet cereal has the sensory detail sweet. Another slider is what I call the interpretive language slider. We can say John ate a bowl of cereal slowly. That does not tell us how to interpret the slowness. But if we say John ate a bowl of cereal resentfully, that language tells us how to interpret the slowness. And finally, the emotional interpretation slider tells us whether or not to explicitly interpret the emotion involved. So if Beth ate a bowl of cereal, that has no emotional interpretive language, but Beth ate her bowl of cereal cheerfully has explicitly emotional interpretive language. So I have just mentioned 4 of many sliders. There are at least 20 or more story adjustment sliders. But altogether, these break the code for storytelling magic. The secret code of an effective story is to give each element just the right kind of focus at just the right time. These are skills of adjustment. They take time to learn and even more time to make automatic. But once you've done that, you can apply them for a lifetime. And that's a key storytelling magic trick that anyone, including you, can learn to master.